So this hand is actually a hand I played from a while ago, which I feel I kind of played it bad, and I want to explain my reason why. So in this hand I 3-bet queens, and our opponent calls. The flop is king high with a flush draw. I c-bet, and my opponent check raises me. So I do end up calling here, and calling it off. And our opponent did show king 5. So let's go over how I think I could have played that hand better and win the most chips from his air type hands and lose the minimum from his king x and hands that beat me. So in this hand I think I play my hand exactly how I think most players would. They c-bet, and if they get check raised they're like, oh well, I've queens here, he could be bluffing, so I'm going to call it off if he 3-barrels me. Especially when the turn's another king, making it less likely that he does have a king. So I want to go over the advantages and disadvantages of checking this flop and how the hand can play out versus some of his ranges. So option A, I c-bet. His hands with little to no equity versus us like Jack 10 offsuit will just check fold to us. His king x will probably check raise us, bloating the pot, and now we are in a tricky spot, possibly facing 3 barrels. His flush draws can check raise us also, and maybe end up blowing us off the hand on later streets. So in option B, I check. His hands with little to no equity versus us like Jack 10 has to bluff to win, so checking back we may get 2 streets of value from his air, which would have just folded to a check raise. His king x after we check back will bet around 180 on the turn and 400 on the river, so we lose a lot less because we didn't bloat the pot, so we are left with around 745 chips and a chance to come back. The way I played my hand, c-betting and calling a raise, I bloated the pot and ended up getting stacked. Versus his flush draws, if we do check back the flop, we can bluff catch versus them calling 2 streets. We will lose the min when it hits and make chips when it misses any bluffs. There is a small possibility of him having a hand like ace x and getting there on the turn if we don't c-bet, but I still think that checking this flop and bluff catching if he leads the turn is better. If he checks the turn, we can then c-bet versus hands with small equity versus us and his weaker pairs. I see this happen a lot where people do c-bet with hands they don't feel comfortable getting check raised with and end up bloating the pot and getting barreled off the best hand. I think you do better checking back this flop. You get to bluff catch versus his air hands that probe the turn. You will also lose the minimum when he does have king x and win chips from his bluffs that would have just folded to your c-bet. I do think that people will think if I check I'm giving him a free card, but his flush draw is never folding to your c-bet. If he does have a flush draw and I check back this flop and the turn is a dud and I get bet into, I can bluff catch. It will also make you harder to play against too when you do have a check back range like queens here. Most players probe turn here when you check back, and you can get 2 streets of value from their bluffs, and more importantly you lose the minimum when he does have kings, when the pot doesn't get bloated if he was planning to check raise you on the flop. Even if your standard is always just a c-bet here, I hope this gives you something to consider. So to summarize my point, I think everyone's c-bet range should be more polarized. Your air hands you already know your c-bet folding, and your strong hands you're c-betting and continuing versus a raise. Your hands in between like queens on a king high flop, if you c-bet and get check raised, you have put yourself in a tricky situation where the pot can get bloated and you may have to fold the best hand. I think that hand should be used to bluff catch and let villain probe versus you with his air, and you will lose less when he does have you beat. You will essentially get the max from his bluffs and lose the minimum when you are beat.